So there aren't that many women who are universally recognized as geniuses. And I would suggest that that's partly because of a topic that sort of came up in the last session. That is the question of who counts as a genius and the nature of genius as it is not an interior mental state. It is a social category recognizable because of conventions, because of a consensus of what a genius looks like. One of the, part of the genius of Marie Curie, which I'll talk about a little today, is her capacity, her ability to understand something that no one else looking at results with radioactivity, what she named radioactivity. Nobody else observed it, nobody else saw it, so she had this incredible insight into a natural process that was somewhat intuitive, grounded in her empirical data, her ability to manipulate the materials she was working with. But she was also a genius in another sense because there's a paradox in her life. And the paradox is that every public performance of Marie Curie's life is as a person who is severe, strict, serious, unsmiling. She is ferocious. She fights with other scientists about how you're going to characterize radioactivity and new elements. She stands up for herself in a very, almost a haughty way. And then, in the diary she wrote after her husband was killed in 1906, an incredibly different person is visible, highly emotional, grieving, overwhelmed by the loss of her husband. And it's also present in her early correspondence. So there is an internal Marie Curie, a personal Marie Curie who is emotional, frightened, lonely, scared, and there's a public Marie Curie who is totally under control. And I believe that that public person who was totally under control facilitated her transformation into one of the very few women who has been identified as a genius. She adopted a social persona that permitted others to interpret her in this way. Now, this photo portrait, she's 36 years old, and she is exactly 12 years away from having been a governess in rural Poland. So she is someone who transformed herself on multiple levels. Rural Poland, by the way, where women were not allowed to enroll in universities. So women were not accepted as students. So this transformation of someone driven by an inside will is the central story of her life. And it shapes the fact that any t-shirt or poster or any list of the greatest scientists in history is likely to include Newton, Copernicus, Darwin, maybe Faraday, although I don't think he always appears. But also, the only woman who appears on such lists is Curie. And the image that appears in these lists is that somber, serious woman staring at the camera, almost angry. It made her a great thinker in a way that other women scientists might not have been able to achieve. But I want to let you know that she was not, by any means, the first woman scientist. So as long as we have anything identified as modern science from the 16th century to the present, there have been women actively involved in science, making significant contributions in the field, in the lab, in theory, in every possible way. And I'll just mention one. This is the Marquise Émilie du Châtelet, an 18th century scientist who was described by her lover Voltaire as a great man, whose only fault is being a woman. So Émilie du Châtelet is most famous for her translation of Newton's Principia, and this is not just a translation of the Principia into French. It is an assessment with many notes and interpretations and additional analyses. And what du Châtelet did was to make Newton legible to a European audience, make it clear how he thought, and spread his ideas. It was a very influential text. It was an almost incomprehensible study for many French scientists, and she was the one who did it. But she also published her own scientific treatises. She worked on what Curie would later call radioactivity. She worked on the nature of fire. She wrote a major book on physics, and she died young. She's probably one of the very few 18th century scientists who died in childbirth. So she was Voltaire's lover and was living with Voltaire on an estate that her husband owned. And her husband was so happy that Voltaire was there because he spent a lot of money keeping the estate up. So one of the best predictors of whether a woman would be involved in science is what we call science in the family. And these are just some married couples, but there were many other iterations of science in the family. So if a woman had a son, brother, cousin, uncle, father, whatever, who was a scientist, the likelihood that she could be an active participant in the scientific enterprise went way up. And that's how women were the quiet lab workers. They were the observers of the stars. They were the illustrators. They were the field assistants. Remember, field scientists often brought their wives out with them, but the wives are invisible parts of the field research, even though they are participating as actively as anyone in the field. And so these are married couples, and this is not quite in the right order. I don't know why it came out wrong, but the first is the Maunders. And what they're famous for is the Maunder minimum. So Annie Maunder worked in the Greenwich Observatory for the man who became her husband. When they married, the observatory, she was a trained astronomer. When they married, the observatory released her, fired her. It was very common, even into the 1960s, for women to be let go by institutions like universities if they married or if they had children. And part of the premise was you can't do two jobs at once. So being a husband was being a wife was a full-time job. And so they would also be dismissed because of anti-nepotism rules. And there's one notorious case in Margaret Rossiter's book where the woman was a tenured professor. When her husband was hired, she was fired. So Annie Maunder was fired, but together they continued to do research on astronomy, and they're known. And the Maunder minimum is the period of absolute minimum sunspot activity from 1645 to 1724 or something like that. So they tracked it down. They figured out when had sunspots been least noticeable. The couple at on the left side you know already, and that's Mileva and Albert Einstein, and this was his first wife, and this question came up in the last session. Did she contribute to his ideas? I like Matt's answer because it's very diplomatic. There's nothing in the correspondence. Women historians who've been interested in gender and science have been very engaged with this question. There's nothing in the correspondence that indicates that she had the idea. So it's not that he never talks with her, but you would be looking for a sign that it is her idea, and we can't find any evidence. So his answer was good and diplomatic. She may have contributed as much as any of his other friends, his network. Everybody makes knowledge in a network. It's always a social product, but she was not the inventor. At least there's no evidence that she was. Perhaps equally famous are Carl and Gertie Corey, and they won the Nobel Prize together for their work on glucose metabolism. They are laboratory scientists, so laboratory biomedical scientists, working very actively together in mid-century America. This begins to be a time after 1945 when women scientists could and did make progress on American campuses, although there is a notorious counterexample. And that's when Maria Geppert-Meyer was hired at the University of Chicago. She was a physicist who had already won the Nobel Prize, and the University of Chicago listed her as their voluntary professor of physics. And voluntary because appointing a woman to a professorship of physics at the University of Chicago in 1967 would have constituted an undesirable precedent that could lead to other women being appointed to the faculty. So we're not talking, not Marie Curie's life, and none of these lives that we're talking about. This is not ancient history. This is very recent, very real, still playing out today in many different ways. And then the smiling couple at the top are Peter and Rosemary Grant, and they have been working on Daphne Major for about 40 years, which is one of the Galapagos Islands, and they have been documenting the evolutionary changes in Galapagos finches, trying to figure out how quickly evolution occurs. But for about the first 30 years of their collaboration in the field, only his name was on the papers. So we have a lot of couples, and this is one of the themes is often, and this is not what happened with Curie, often the collaboration disadvantages one member of the partnership. So science in the family is important, and I want to turn now to Curie's family. What was the family life, the Sklodowsky children, what was the family life that she experienced, and how did it shape her ambitions for science, her desire to be a scientist? Honestly, I can't think of a worse time and place to be born, a worse situation to try to pursue science. Women were banned from Polish universities. Not only that, the area of Poland she lived in was under the control of the Russians, and the Russians oppressed the Poles, did not want Poles educated in the Polish language. So Maria, she was called Mania as a child. Mania as a child learned Russian, Polish, but also French and German. By the time she arrived in Paris at age 23, she already knew at least 4 languages. When she wrote her autobiography, she wrote it in English. So she learned a 5th language as an adult. But she was it was oppressed circumstances, and her father was, because he was a Polish nationalist, because he was a loyalist to Poland. And Poland, remember, had been divided and under the control of Austria, Germany, and Russia for about 100 years at this point. But there were still Polish nationalists trying to bring Poland back. And her father was a Polish nationalist, which meant he lost a series of jobs. There was a decreasing economic security in the course of her childhood. There were tragedies. Her oldest sister on the far right died when she was 9 years old of an infectious disease. Her mother died when she was 10 of tuberculosis. Her mother had been separated from the family for several years, and historians believe that this photo of the 5 children was taken for the benefit of the mother who was in a sanatorium and who could not see her children. So it's a very difficult circumstances culturally, politically, economically, and by the time Manya was of an age where she might be interested in pursuing a higher education, in learning the science she was interested in. I mean, there was one little bright spot. Her father taught chemistry and physics at high schools, and he brought experiments home, and he kept laboratory materials at home, and he wanted his children to know, all of them, girls and the son, to know science and mathematics. So she did have a mentor in her father, someone directly interested in her understanding science. And this father, Vladislav, was admittedly not able to fully support the family. So there's a correspondence where he says, I can't afford to send you to school. I have no money to support you. And as a result of this economic reality, Manya and her sister Bronislava, came up with a pact. And the pact was that Manya would work as a governess somewhere in Poland for however many years it took for Bronya to earn her medical degree in Paris. Paris was chosen because, unlike many other places in Europe, the Sorbonne, the universities in France and the Sorbonne in Paris accepted women students. And so there was a possibility of them enrolling at the Sorbonne. In addition, there was a significant Polish expatriate community in Paris, which meant that if you went there, you would have fellow travelers to share the experience with. And Bronya wanted to be a physician. Part of her dream was associated with her mother's death of tuberculosis. Eventually, Bronya and her husband, Kazimir, established a tuberculosis sanatorium in Poland itself, so they came back to Poland. So this is the dream is that Mania will send the money to Bronya in Paris for however many years it takes. And in order to make this happen, her name wasn't Marie Curie at this time. She was Mania Sklodowska, and she worked as a governess in rural Poland. In this family, she fell in love. The oldest son fell in love with her. She fell in love with the oldest son. They got engaged, and the parents said she was a poverty-stricken nobody, and they would not allow their son to marry her. And so this is one of the early crises in her life when she ends up giving up on Kazimir, which was the name of the son here too as well. She worked as a governess for about 2.5 years. And so she had this, how to put it, piecemeal education as a young person. She did go to school. She transferred to one of the Russian schools when she was about 12 years old because her father felt that she would get a better education, even though the Russian schools were considered inferior to what was called the Polish floating universities. So many Polish intellectuals would teach classes in their homes at night, and this would be a catch-as-catch-can education, not systematic, not leading to a general degree, but providing her with a lot of information and training. So she worked as a governess for, I guess, about 2.5 years. And in 1891, Bronya wrote to her sister and said, "Come to Paris. I finished my degree." She was then engaged, about to marry her husband, who was a Polish expatriate in Paris. "Come to Paris and you can stay with us. We have an apartment. We're not that close to the Sorbonne, but you can live with us. We will support you." And by this time, Mania had been saving as much money as she could, sending as much money as she could send to Bronya, and therefore she hesitates. She has about 6 weeks when she's terrified and says, "I should just stay here. What am I doing? This is crazy." And Bronya shows up in Poland and says, "Get to Paris." So she did it, and she did it with her sister. So there's a quid pro quo. There's a quid pro quo, a deal between them for an outcome. And in 1891, she arrived in Paris. She was astonishingly, within 4 years, the top student in mathematics and in physics at the Sorbonne. So she had something at this young age, this drive, this intelligence, her professors noticed her. And and she wasn't the only woman student at this time. There were foreign students at the Sorbonne, not as many French women students. But she was scoring, her scores were at the top of her class in all the final exams. And one of her students was one of her professors was the physicist Gabriel Lippmann, and he thought she was so talented that when she completed what we would consider her undergraduate work, he asked her to become a research associate on a project that was being conducted for the French steel industry to test the qualities of different kinds of tempered steel. And when she was working on this project, she found the laboratory facilities that Gabriel Lippmann made available to her somewhat inferior. She complained to some friends, and some friends said, "Oh, I know someone who might have a good lab for you." And what we don't know for sure is whether this was intended as a match. What we do know is that within about 24 hours of meeting each other, they were enchanted. The first conversations were about physics and chemistry and laboratory facilities, and apparently by the end of the evening, they'd gotten to politics, liberalism, God, maybe the meaning of life, we don't know. This was the summer of 1894, and they were very, very quickly, there was a little bit of doubt, because it seems as though Maria often, when we look at the hidden paper trail, she had a tendency to to second guess herself. She would make a decision and then she'd say, should I do this? And she'd do a list and she'd consult her friends and she'd say how unsure she was, and then she would leap. And so they were married in the summer of 1895. It was a simple civil ceremony. She wore a navy blue dress, and immediately they bought 2 bikes for themselves. They both loved biking. These outfits we know because Marie Curie kept meticulous spending records of every penny they spent. She was that kind of person. And these were special made biking clothes. So this is the Lycra of 1895. These are full biking outfits, and those are modern, uniquely modern bikes. That is, they have the 2 wheels the same size, they have air-filled wheels. All these things were new. And so they're showing themselves to be modern. There's so many modern elements to this marriage. It's unusual, it's not a traditional marriage. It's built around the idea that they will pursue science together. After their marriage, fairly quickly, I guess it's within 2 years, they had their first child. And by December of and this is Irene, she goes on to win a Nobel Prize later. And from one of Marie Curie's letters, she describes their lives and says, we have time only for science and family. So that they don't have a huge social life. They feel constrained by the demands of the laboratory. They have a very inadequate laboratory. Pierre was by that time, he was a PhD employed at a relatively low status technical school, and she had no job at all. She was a graduate student at this point. So she's beginning work for a PhD in 1897, and in 1897, in December of 1897, Marie Curie turned her attention to the peculiar situation in which uranium salts could have an impact on photographic plates. So there was some kind of energy in uranium salts. And the reason she knows it's there is because Henri Becquerel, starting in 1895, had announced to the scientific community that he accidentally left some uranium salts in a drawer in the dark, and they had an impact on a photographic plate. He had his entire family, Becquerel's family had devoted their scientific lives to phosphorescence, and he believed that what he was seeing was phosphorescence, and phosphorescence was producing the changes in the photographic plate. So Becquerel published, I think it's 6 papers on the phosphorescent uranium salts in 1896, maybe 2 more in 1897. There's a little bit of a discussion about it, but far more exciting to most of their peers and most scientists at the time were Röntgen's discovery of X-rays, which is a different phenomenon, and everybody was studying X-rays, and Becquerel gave up on the uranium salts and the phosphorescence. So what Curie did was to sort of pick up, this is one of the elements of genius might be, she picked up a subject that she thought was interesting and that much of the scientific community had decided was less interesting. There was nothing more to say. What else to say about Becquerel's uranium salts? And she, from the very beginning, we know, in 1897, she said, I think this is a fundamental property of the structure of matter. And why did she think that? So there's something, she's observing it, she has this intuition that there's something fundamental going on, and very quickly, by March of 1898, she has evidence of 2 new elements. And how does she have this evidence? It's the pitch blende. So she's working with the pitch blende, and she figures out that the pitch blende has more radioactivity, and that's her word. She invents the word. It has more radioactivity than uranium. And then she says, there's something in here that's different that we don't know about. Then she starts working with thorium, and she finds that thorium has even more radioactivity. So she doesn't know what it is, but she thinks she might have 2 new elements. And that animates her research. And that's why in March of 1898, Pierre Curie dropped his work on electricity and moved into her lab. So the collaboration began after Marie Curie had spent 5 months obsessing on these questions, coming to the conclusion that there were 2 new elements, recognizing that there might be something even more important about this, which is that it would illuminate the nature of matter. And that's, nobody else had thought that. So he joins her in 1898, and they begin full-time to try to identify the 2 new elements, to name them. They become polonium and radium. And they're trying to, definitely have enough evidence to persuade other scientists that there are 2 new elements, that that's what they're looking at in the radioactivity. And they succeed in doing that. And in May of 1903, Marie Curie defended her doctoral dissertation, and in December, she was awarded the Nobel Prize. So that's a pretty good record for a new PhD. And they shared it with Henri Becquerel, but they didn't share it evenly. It wasn't 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. It was half to the Curies, as though they were one person, and half to Henri Becquerel. It could have been worse, because in the summer of 1903, Pierre got a letter from a mathematician, in Sweden, who was on the Nobel Prize committee, Gustav Mittag-Leffler. And Mittag-Leffler was a known supporter of women scientists. He had played a critical role in the appointment of the Russian mathematician Sofia Kovalevskaya to Stockholm University. She was the first woman appointed to the faculty at Stockholm University. And Mittag-Leffler wrote to Pierre and said, "You should know that you are being considered without your wife's inclusion." And Pierre wrote back to the Nobel Committee, and he said, "You cannot consider me in isolation from my wife. Marie has played a critical role in this research. She has to be on the Nobel Prize nomination." And because of his objection and his insistence that she be included, her name was added to the prize citation. She had actually been nominated the year before because of her papers on radioactivity in 1900, which she published alone, and without his name. And so they just used the nomination from 1902 and added it to the 1903 nomination. That's why she won in 1903. In some ways, this is a wonderful moment. It's a great moment for the Curies. Immediately, Pierre gets appointed to the Sorbonne. He becomes a professor of physics at the Sorbonne. Marie can't be appointed a professor because she's female, but she was given a paid research assistantship. So they have a good laboratory, they have support, they have legitimacy, they get prestige from this 1903 Nobel Prize, and they also get something a little bit more mixed for them. Remember time only for science and family? Well, suddenly there's also time for journalists, and they become world famous. This is only, the Nobel Prize was only given for the first time in 1901. So this is only the 3rd award of the Nobel Prize. It's not quite as well known at this time as it is today. And Pierre and Marie did not even go to the Nobel Prize ceremony. Marie had suffered a miscarriage about a month before the ceremony, and she was not feeling well, so they didn't want to go to Stockholm for this award. But they were inundated with journalists coming to their home, to their apartment, and or to their house. And Pierre made fun of it. The journalists were reporting what their daughter ate for breakfast. And so this sense of being suddenly public personalities in a way that really neither one of them liked. But one of the friendships that grew out of this was from this American dancer, Loa Fuller. And she was famous for her use of wide silk dresses, which would then be lit brightly in a creative way, so that the dance was a dance of a body, but also the light of the silk. She contacted the Curies and she said she wanted an outfit made with radium, and they said that was not going to be possible. They couldn't do that. But she became a friend and actually came to dinners at their home, became a part of their social network. And the strange thing about Lois Fuller is that she remained friends with Marie Curie for the rest of their lives. So there was some kind of a connection with this American dancer that Marie Curie had. And that's another sort of a counterintuitive thing in her life, in the life story. So there's a moment here of happiness, fame, security, a good laboratory. And then, in 1906, Pierre Curie, crossing a crowded Paris street on a rainy afternoon, was run over and killed by a wagon. And Marie was a widow, a young widow and by this time, she had a 2-year-old and 8-year-old. So she has 2 young children. She's lost, it's not just losing her husband, she's lost her intellectual partner, her scientific collaborator, the person indeed also who protected her. Pierre protected her over and over again from all the vagaries of French culture and the cruelties of the French scientific community, who could be unfair to her at various times. And she finds herself then utterly bereft, and she wrote a diary for about 6 months, written entirely to him. It's a series of letters to him in French, which is the language of their love. And it was not available for any historian to read until about 10 years ago, when it became possible to read it. And it's a diary where you see very, very clearly the kind of emotional trauma and stress that she went through in losing Pierre. It would have been traditional in European guild culture for a woman to take the place of her husband. That is, a woman might not be able to run a corporation, but if her husband was killed, she could be placed in charge of it, or she might be able to take a particular job. This is precisely what happened with Marie Curie. She was instantly appointed the first female professor of the Sorbonne. Her husband was dead. She was appointed to the Sorbonne, and she began to work. She had been working, and she began seriously to work on completely purifying and characterizing, in terms of the Mendeleev periodic table of elements, characterizing polonium and radium. So remember, they knew they had 2 new elements, but they had not purified them. They didn't have a pure sample of them. They knew there was something important there, but they didn't have the right kind of sample. So she starts trying to get this sample, and gradually over the next few years, she begins to succeed. So she's a leader in the scientific community. She has a series. Her father-in-law moved in with the family to help her care for the children, to be a family presence there. And in addition, she had a series of Polish nannies so that the girls learned Polish. So things are kind of going okay. And then in 1911 is another bad year for Marie Curie. So early in the year, she had decided to try to seek admission to the French Academy of Sciences. The French Academy of Sciences actually didn't accept any women until, 1968. They didn't accept her in 1911. And the French Academy of Sciences, in order to even seek admission, you had to go around Paris and meet with people at their homes and ask them to vote for you. And she found the whole process humiliating, didn't want to go through with it, and it wasn't her style to do this kind of thing, but she thought it would help her laboratory. So she did it, and she got turned down by 2 votes. And that was kind of upsetting, but then that spring, in 1911, a secret apartment that she had taken with one of Pierre's former students, Paul Langevin. He was a married French physicist, and they were having a romantic love affair, and they had their own pied-à-terre near the Sorbonne where they could meet. The apartment had a locked drawer that included many love letters between the two. And someone broke into the apartment in April of 1911 and stole the love letters. The theory is that it was Mrs. Langevin, not her, but an agent of Mrs. Langevin who broke in, who figured out that an affair was going on, figured out where the apartment was, and broke in. And all summer, Mrs. Langevin and her mother are threatening to give these letters to the press. And these letters then will, so this is summer of 1911, they'll undermine Curie's reputation, they'll hurt Langevin, who knows what will happen if these letters get published. And in November, on November 1st, 1911, or November 2nd, the first of the hint of the letters appears in the French press. Langevin is the person all the way to the right in this picture, and you can see Curie, you can also see Einstein. This was the first Solvay conference in Brussels, and both Langevin and Curie had gone to the conference. The mother-in-law of Paul Langevin gives an interview to the press and says, Paul has left town with Marie Curie. So they were in Brussels together, but this was not a romantic, meeting. And very quickly, a series of other letters came out, some of them quite damaging. And the evil character in the press coverage of this event was seen as Marie Curie. So Marie Curie was seen as destroying a French marriage, threatening French pronatalism. So she had written a letter to Paul where she said, whatever you do, don't have any more children with your wife. And this was seen as fighting, French children, and she was suddenly a Polish interloper who was dangerous for the French population. This is a wild event, a wild scandal, and it was the subject of 5 duels. So most of these duels are between journalists, and these would be journalists who supported Madame Langevin and journalists who supported Madame Curie. And the duels are all to first blood, which means nobody died. And most of the first blood was a cut on the arm. I was kind of trying to track what was the blood, and somehow somebody's arm would be cut. And then it would be over, and honor was restored as a result of, the honor of both was implicated. There was one duel that Paul Langevin felt that there was one journalist who had been particularly cruel to Marie Curie, and Langevin said, I have to duel him, I have to challenge him to a duel. All of these were in very public places. They would be in a major park. They would call other journalists to witness them. There would be witnesses in seconds and selection of weapons, and they were intended as public performances of honor and legitimacy. So when Langevin challenged this journalist, they met in some central park, public park in Paris, and at the crucial moment, the journalist refused to lift his gun. And all these people are watching, and Langevin has his gun up, but he's not going to shoot somebody whose gun is at his side. And he announces in a loud voice, I cannot deny French science of the genius of Paul Langevin. So he doesn't shoot him. So it's a show, and one thing this is as much, Marie Curie, whose honor was actually most impugned by these events, would have been unable to be involved in a duel because this is a masculine performance of honor. In the year after these, the other crucial thing is right in the middle of this. So it's about the second week of November, she wins the second Nobel Prize. And so she wins it for the purification of polonium and radium. And she gets a horrible letter from Svante Arrhenius who says, given the scandal, perhaps you should turn it down. And she writes back and says, I don't see how my personal life has any bearing on my scientific life. And she showed up and accepted the prize. So she hadn't gone to the 1903 ceremony, but she went to the 1911 ceremony to receive her Nobel Prize. But the following year was very difficult. She became ill. She went to Britain to stay with another woman physicist, Hertha Ayrton. She withdrew from much public life in France. She gradually came back, and then, in a peculiar way, the First World War provided her with an opportunity to redeem her reputation. And that redemption, that's Einstein and Curie were friends. I'll say one thing about what Einstein, when the rumors first appeared of her affair with Paul Langevin, he wrote to a friend, she has a sparkling intellect, but she's not pretty enough to threaten anyone's marriage. So one of the themes, if you study the history of scientists, which I do, I work on male scientists and female scientists, I've never seen a description of a male scientist which reduced his life to whether he was attractive or not. But over and over again, even in Marquise du Châtelet, the woman I showed you earlier, her father decided that she could learn science because she was so ugly she would never be able to catch a husband. So this idea that that's the determining thing in a woman's life and that shapes whether she can participate in science is completely missing. Oh, I'm way behind, sorry. So anyway, they were friends, and he was very supportive to her. He tried to help her through this crisis. But in 1914, she redeemed herself basically by inventing the X-ray truck for the French front. And she drove an X-ray truck. Her beloved daughter, Irene, drove an X-ray truck. They learned how to change tires. They learned how to fix X-ray machines and how to carry around generators so that you could use the... And the point of this is to serve French troops so that doctors can find bullets, find broken legs, find cracked bones, using the X-ray as a medical technology. This means that she and Irene were exposed to radiation. That is, the X-ray machines were as nothing compared to the safety of modern X-ray technology. And in addition, it means that her 17 and 18-year-old daughter was exposed to the experience of seeing young men horribly, grievously wounded by the military technologies of the First World War. So it took tremendous courage for her to do this. She trained 150 nurses to drive these X-ray trucks. She enlisted the help of wealthy women all over France. She asked them to donate money and to donate trucks, which could be modified and made into these X-ray trucks. And as the war unfolded, she became a heroine. And so this redeemed her. It made her truly French again. She was no longer Polish. And it was a transformative event, both in her fame, in her life. It was very difficult for her laboratory, and indeed for much of the war, work in her laboratory ceased. This is partly because the one thing Marie Curie cared most about was her sample of radium. And when the war began and she was afraid that the Germans might take Paris, she moved the radium to southern France. So her laboratory ceased to be a center for radium research in 1914 to 1918, and she devoted her time to frontline service in the medical treatment of French soldiers. And the theory is that this is part of what made her sick later in her life. So in the 1920s, she begins to build the Curie Institute, the Curie Laboratory, and this is Irene becoming the scientist she would later be. She also defends the Curie name. This person here was actually named Alfred Curie, but he was a pediatrician in southern France. He had no relationship to the Curie family, and he actually had no relation to this cream, which would keep you young, supposedly. And she pursued lawsuits against him to stop him from using the Curie name. So she's defending the name, the fame. She's taking, this is clearly, it's a fraudulent product. She doesn't want her name associated with it. And so she's an active defender of the Curie legacy. In 1921, she and her two daughters came to the United States in order to collect a gram of radium which had been purchased with the help of wealthy American women because of the efforts of a journalist named Missy Maloney. The equivalent price that they paid for radium would be about $1 million today. So this is a very expensive commodity, and Missy Maloney had asked her in an interview years before, what is the one thing you need the most? And she said, more radium. And so Missy Maloney did a campaign, got all this together, and managed to arranged for Curie and her daughters to come to the United States to collect the radium, but also it was a publicity campaign. It was a celebration of her work and her life. President Harding presented Curie with a gram of radium, but at this time, she's not actually holding the radium. By this time, the radium is in a lead box on the boat. So she's figured out, she and her peers now understand how dangerous the radium is. Pierre would walk around with radioactive materials in his pockets and be amused and show people the burnt skin under the material. They kept radium at times by their bedside. They were enchanted with it. But they begin to understand through a variety of sources that this is a dangerous practice and they need to be careful. And then in 1934, after an illness that included anemia, an infection, she had been sickly for about 18 months. She had been at a sanatorium in eastern France. And so she was 60-something. It's not an incredibly young death. And she was also, and it's not crystal clear that it was caused by exposure to radiation, although in all likelihood it's at least partly implicated in her poor health as her life progressed. And she and Pierre were moved to the Pantheon in Paris in 1995. So at the end of her life, however, she has a massive empire which she has built and sustained and directed. And in 1935, Irene and her husband Frederick, who by the way took her name, Frederick Joliot-Curie, win the Nobel Prize in chemistry for their discovery of artificial radioactivity. So I want to tell you why you are so glad you are not in this family, okay? Because family dinners must be horrible. They have 6 Nobel Prizes in the family. It's impossible to compete. Not only that, you have to be a physicist. So the Curie family, even to this day, they have a long line of continuing physicists trained in this tradition. And the granddaughter of Marie Curie even married the grandson of Paul Langevin. So these ties continue through time and through history, and this is an incredibly competitive and powerful family. One of the key chroniclers, and if you ever read a biography of Marie Curie, if you read one in your elementary school textbook or your high school or a children's book, it was based on the work of Eve Curie. So Marie Curie's younger daughter devoted her life to the legacy of Marie Curie. And this is the famous book. This was produced only 3 years after the death of Curie. She rapidly, and this is my copy of the book. You can see I must have bought it for $15 in a used bookstore. But it is signed by Eve Curie. And so she determined what the story would be. And as a result, the Langevin affair appears as a single sentence, as a misunderstanding, when we know that it wasn't a misunderstanding. They really were having an affair. So there are things in the book that she wanted to suppress, things she wanted to emphasize, and one thing she emphasized over and over again was her mother's autonomy, her mother's intellectual autonomy. She was not merely following her father. She did a lot of this on her own. Eve lived until 2007. She died aged 102 in Manhattan, and this is her in 1961. And then I'll just quickly run through this. It's partly, I'm not blaming Marie Curie for the atomic bomb, but this is Röntgen's picture of his wife's hand in the wedding ring. It's pretty clear that the incredible efflorescence of interest in the nature of the atom and the nature of matter that Curie thought up, she dreamed it up, led then pretty directly through Lise Meitner to the atomic bomb. And so, and when I say it's unfortunate timing, the paper that Lise Meitner wrote with her nephew was published in 1939. And anybody who read that paper, Japanese, German, English, South African, Japanese, any physicist who read that paper would think, as Einstein did, you might be able to build a bomb. There's a lot of energy in the atom. If we can figure out how to release it, this could be a weapon. And 1939 is a totally terrible time for anybody to realize that. And so if you think about the fact that the first Trinity test came after the fall of Berlin in July 1945, that took $2 billion to get to this point, not $2 billion in today's dollars, $2 billion in the 1940s dollars to get to that point in July 1945. In the absence of a global war and the threat of a Nazi takeover of Europe, there would not have been the motivation to try to build a weapon of this type so quickly. And then the use of the weapon then provoked an arms race with devastating consequences. So it's not Marie Curie's fault, but she is definitely a part of this trail of the beginning of understanding something that has unfortunate and really unintended consequences. This is from the museum in her honor in Poland. Supposedly, the first Casimir that she met when she was a governess used to sit outside by this statue and mourn for her. And this is her picture from 1903. What I want to suggest is that I am a diversity search advisor for the University of Pennsylvania, which means that I help departments recruit and retain people who are underrepresented minorities in different fields. The nature of underrepresented minority differs in different fields, but for many of the sciences, one of the key underrepresented minorities, alas, in 2019, is women. And so when we think about the difficulties that women in science, that girls, high school girls, middle school girls, college, graduate school, and assistant professors, the difficulties they face, all I can say is that it makes me admire the courage and the strength and the discipline of Marie Curie even more. Thank you.